Greetings, magical mavens, and welcome to the next installment of our cyclical living series for the 2024 into 2025 year, the astrology of the wheel of the year, and this time we're talking about Scorpio season. So if you're new around here on this channel, we like to approach the pagan wheel of the year from a slow living / cyclical living perspective, as opposed to just looking at it as specific Sabbats that we have to celebrate on individual days of the year. So rather than having to cram all of our seasonal magic into one day a season, or even just the weekend or the week surrounding a Sabbat, we instead like to split the year up into 8 equal sections, each that are about 6 weeks long. This gives us a whole 6 weeks to slow down and truly embrace the magic of each of the seasons. So for the past several years on this channel, we have done just that. We have split the year up into those 8 seasons of 6 weeks long. But to dive even deeper and zoom in even closer into the plant tend harvest compost cycle that everything in the universe, including us, goes through, this year we're deepening our cyclical living practice by splitting up the year into 12 equal sections of about 4 weeks long, the zodiacal wheel of the year. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the magic of Scorpio season. This time, we're celebrating the witchy Sabbat known as Samhain, or November's Eve, which takes place at the very peak of Scorpio season. Samhain is considered the third of 3 harvest festivals on the pagan wheel of the year. Celebrated around November 1st in the Northern Hemisphere and May 1st in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the cross quarter or middle point between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. In the weeks surrounding this harvest festival, autumn is still in full swing, but we're shifting out of those early fall vibes and into the energy of the holiday season, which will eventually transition us into winter. Similar to the waning moon phase, this season invites us to begin looking back at the year that's coming to a close, reaping the benefits of it, and releasing any energy, habits, or patterns that we don't want to take forward with us into the next year. In this video, I'll be sharing with you 4 fun and powerful ways to harness the energy of this time of year by tapping into all 4 elements. Above and beyond just typical traditions you've probably heard about a million times over, instead, we're diving much deeper into how to harness the actual astrology of the season to maximize our joy and fulfillment in late autumn. Here on this channel, we like to embrace a slower living approach to celebrating the wheel of the year, not cramming all our traditions into one day, or even just the week surrounding the Sabbat, but instead to gradually embrace each season for multiple weeks surrounding each Sabbat. This approach is beautifully supported by astrology. If you're new to the concept of how the zodiac signs and the witchy wheel of the year are intrinsically linked, you're really gonna love this series. In the first 3 videos in this series, I've already gone deeply into detail on exactly how mind-blowing this correlation is, so I'm not going to take up too much time going over it again in this video. But in short, the zodiac wheel and the pagan Sabbat wheel are one and the same. It's just that the Sabbat system breaks up the year into 8 parts, whereas zodiac astrology breaks it up into 12. The main anchor points are still the solstices, equinoxes, and cross quarters, but where in witchcraft each quarter of the year is divided into 2 Sabbat seasons, astrology splits each quarter of the year into 3 phases, providing an even deeper and more nuanced perspective of how the plant tend harvest compost cycle works in the universe through the magical power of 3. Just like the visible phases of the moon that make up the triple moon symbol we like to use as witches, this maiden mother crone concept also appears in the phases of each season. Where the Sabbats show us how each of the 4 main seasons has an early and a late phase, astrology shows us a more zoomed in view of each season's beginning, middle, and end, and how the Sabbats are perfectly placed to celebrate the most potent and powerful points within this cycle. Astrology can seem really complicated, but if you're at all familiar with the witchy wheel of the year, you're already well on your way to understanding astrology. The basic concept of the Sabbats provides the base level framework for how astrology works, and you can easily build your knowledge from that place. If you're curious about those mind-blowing details of how all things in the universe fit together perfectly, I invite you to go back and watch the introduction video for this series. But for this video, we're looking at the astrology of the third harvest Sabbath and how to celebrate using these more nuanced astrological themes. Samhain / November's Eve / Halloween is one of the most magical days of the year, and modern witches have adapted this celebration mainly from the culture of ancient European pagans who celebrated this season historically. This is typically the case with the Sabbats known as the cross quarters on the Wheel of the Year. The solstices and equinoxes are recognized by most ancient cultures across the world, but the Celtic culture was unique in the way that it venerated the height of each season more so than the beginning of each season. Even though the Celts didn't recognize astrology in the Greco-Roman style that's been passed down to us, they had an awareness of the energy of what we now call the fixed zodiac signs. The cross-quarter Sabbats inspired by the 4 Celtic fire festivals are Imbolc at the center of Aquarius and the center of wintertime, Beltane at the center of Taurus and the center of springtime, Lammas, the center of Leo and the center of summertime, and Samhain at the center of Scorpio and the center of the autumn time. Now, I do want to just quickly touch upon the concept that everyone's practice is different, and you might count the beginning or middle of a season at a different time than the list that I just gave. For example, I know some people who really like to follow closely to the Irish tradition say that Imbolc is not the center of winter, but the start of spring. And in that climate, that does make sense. However, from an astronomical and astrological perspective, it doesn't quite work that way. Astrologically, the year is broken up into 4 seasons that are then broken up into 3 different zodiac signs. And that does fit really well with the way some of us, especially in the US, seem to view the Sabbats typically. There's the astronomical perspective, there's the meteorological perspective, which will be different depending on where you live, and then of course there are the many cultural perspectives. Personally, I really enjoy looking at the astronomical perspective first because it's the most basic and core level, sort of universal truth, I almost want to say, and then everything else is kind of a human interpretation of it, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with, but for me, as someone who doesn't have super strong cultural ties to any specific country or historical culture, it just makes the most sense for me to look at what I see as the raw and core truth before then adding meaning on top of it. But you do what works for you. I just wanted to insert that little disclaimer because while everyone who tends to comment on these videos on YouTube seems to be either totally down with what I'm saying or they might have a slightly different perspective and they're still totally open-minded, I have had someone on TikTok try to school me on that. And I just wanted to address that because they did bring up a very valid point. If we're going to be using the terms that were derived from ancient cultures, it is important to recognize that the cultures might have seen it differently than the way we see it now. But at the same time, I don't think any of us should have to defend why we practice the way we do. So there's that. But regardless of whether you follow a Neo-Celtic path or any other specific type of path, almost all cultures celebrated the harvest and recognized the theme of death in late fall. And it's still a powerful practice for us modern magical folk who may or may not be that close to the agricultural cycle. The cross-quarter Sabbats are the height of each of the 4 seasons, and they land right in the middle of each of the fixed zodiac signs. The zodiacs that represent the most pure form of each of the 4 elements. So for Scorpio season, which we're in now, it's the 8th sign of the zodiac, and it's associated with the pagan Sabbath known as Samhain, which I like to call November's Eve, and which most people call Halloween. From a seasonal living perspective, the sun moves into the sign of Scorpio at the halfway point between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. And Samhain, celebrated in the northern hemisphere around November 1st, falls smack dab in the middle of Scorpio season. Scorpio energy is the pure expression of the divine feminine water element, and its main theme is intensity. It also deals with themes of desire, passion, curiosity, and psychic intuition, and it invites us to recognize the more shadowy or intense themes in life, as well as the taboo. This period between about October 22nd and about November 22nd is a great time to focus on what personal development and psychology enthusiasts like to call shadow work. The practice of seeking to acknowledge and understand the darker side of ourselves and of life so that we can achieve a state of healthy balance rather than falling into unhealthy patterns of polarity or denial. The alchemical element of Scorpio is water, an element of deep feelings, spirituality, intuition, and emotional depth. Scorpio's quality or modality is fixed, the modality related to the most seemingly consistent part of a season. In this case, the height and epitome of the autumn season. With Scorpio season being the center point and epitome of autumn, and Samhain being both the center point of Scorpio season and the center point between the equinox and the solstice, Samhain is essentially a holiday celebrating the very essence of autumn time. Back in September, we had Mabon, the start of the fall season. It celebrated the halfway mark of the sun's waning phase, when the nights began to grow longer than the days here in the Northern Hemisphere. But for many of us, the fall was really just getting started. Now, the season of autumn is well and truly here. The symbol for Scorpio is the scorpion, an animal that strikes fear in the hearts of humans and instinctively triggers us to feel into the darker side of nature and life. The glyph for Scorpio has a curled and pointed tail on it, reminiscent of both the stabbing tail of a scorpion and the devil, another pop culture embodiment of the taboo. So that can kind of help you remember which glyph is which. Scorpio's ruling planet is Pluto, the luminary that represents the shadow self in astrology, as well as the taboo side of power, corresponding to Hades, god of the underworld in Greek mythology. The key phrase for Scorpio is I desire, and it represents intensity and depth. Just like every Sabbath has its opposite on the wheel of the year, so too does every zodiac sign. We're empowered to achieve balance each season by being mindful of the spectrum between the two. So just as Samhain, or November's Eve, is opposite on the wheel of the year from Beltane, or May's Eve, the opposite of Scorpio is Taurus, the fixed sign that represents the height of the spring season 6 months later, around the 1st of May. What we notice about these opposites is that they aren't really true opposites, but just opposite sides of the same spectrum of themes. Scorpio and Samhain season deals with the themes of shadow, decline, death, and decay, whereas Taurus and Beltane season deals with themes of light, fertility, birth, and growth. Both signs encourage us to understand and appreciate the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, albeit through different approaches. Scorpio acknowledges the power that comes along with age and experience, while Taurus embodies the power of youth and potency. Together, they form a dynamic axis that balances the very essence of the overall plant, tend, harvest, compost cycle of the seasons as a whole. And while we're on the subject of spectrums, I think it's important to address the hemispheres as they apply to the Wheel of the Year and the Zodiac Wheel. As we all know, the traditional Wheel of the Year, which modern pagans have borrowed from the Wicca religion, is oriented to the Northern Hemisphere. And based on my experience communing with witches from all around the world online, it's most common for pagans in the Southern Hemisphere to reverse the wheel to appropriately fit their seasons. And what's really magical about this concept of reversal is that it too reminds us not just of the imperfection of the biased perspective of the Wheel of the Year, but actually of the perfect balance of the universe. You see, even though the Southern Hemisphere is celebrating Beltane when my neck of the woods is celebrating Samhain, that doesn't render it contradictory that it's Scorpio season regardless of where you live. It actually still makes sense. Just as the late autumn represents these intense themes of balance between fertility and death, late spring represents those exact same themes, just focusing more on the fertility aspect. Overall, birth always leads to death and vice versa, especially to our ancestors who were much more personally involved in the concept of where their food came from and didn't have access to the healthcare technology that we do now. They knew that the animals that were breeding in the spring would have to be slaughtered later on for food, and that not only does every person who's born eventually die, but it was also a lot more common for pregnancy and birth to be potentially fatal for both the mother and child. Both concepts that are still true today, but our culture has become a lot more distant from them, essentially pushing these themes further into what Jungian psychology would call the shadow. And for a more lighthearted and relatable example for most of us, even just the seed starting compost we use to kickstart our gardening ventures in the spring is the remains of dead stuff from the previous year's harvest, whether you're involved in composting it yourself or if you purchase it ready-made. In our lives, as in nature, it's always important to maintain a sense of balance, and the Wheel of the Year demonstrates for us that balance comes in many forms. There's a time and place for everything. It isn't always about a perfect state of neutral moderation. Scorpio season is an example of a time when the scales are tipped towards the feminine theme of emotion and inner wisdom. But of course, it needs to be tempered with balance. And astrologically, the balance is there when we tap into the full spectrum of the Scorpio-Taurus axis. This is often exhibited in our witchy traditions as we celebrate the Wheel of the Year. In my practice as a domestic witch and a green witch, Scorpio season is a time for harvesting the last of the garden crops and composting any of the inedible remains of the garden, but at the same time, I'm still harvesting, preserving, and cooking the fruits of my labor, still very much focused on the themes of abundance and gratitude that have been running through all three of the harvest Sabbaths. For no matter what the season, we can't have one side of the coin without the other. And interestingly enough, the actual astrology of each zodiac season supports this concept of balance. For every Scorpio season contains within it a full moon in the opposite sign of Taurus. You see, when the sun is in any given sign, the full moon has to take place in the opposite sign, because the full moon is a type of transit known as an opposition, meaning that the sun and moon are on opposite sides of the solar system, which is why we're able to see the reflection of the sun's light illuminating the entire face of the moon. This year, the full moon in Taurus is on November 15th. These are just the kinds of things in my witchy practice that get me really excited to nerd out over the wonder of the universe. By celebrating both the solar Sabbath and embracing its opposite by celebrating the full moon, we're able to accept the universe's gift of perfect balance. When we approach our cyclical living in this way, we're all embracing the same spectrum of themes, whether we're in the northern or southern hemisphere, just in different ways. And if that all wasn't mind-blowing enough, there's even more. There is also a way to tune in with the balancing of all four elements within this cyclical living approach to astrology. Just as the sun cycles through the 12 signs, leading it to also cycle through each of the four elements 3 times in a year, the moon actually does the exact same thing, only on a monthly basis instead of yearly. During each moon cycle, the moon spends a couple of days in each of the 12 signs, and when we take note of the 4 main phases of the lunar cycle, that being the new moon, first quarter moon, full moon, and last quarter, we get a perfect dose of all 4 elements. Surrounding the Scorpio season, we have the new moon in Scorpio, the fixed sign of the feminine water element. This is the obligatory conjunction between the sun and moon that results in the predictable new moon that happens in the same sign the sun is in every zodiac season. Then there's the first quarter waxing moon in Aquarius, the fixed sign of the masculine air element. And then the following week, there's the full moon in Taurus, the fixed sign of the feminine earth element. This is the obligatory opposition between the sun and moon that results in the predictable full moon that always happens in the opposite sign from what the sun is in every zodiac season. And finally, there's the last quarter waning moon in the sign of Leo, the fixed sign of the masculine fire element. Now, notice that I've pointed out how all 4 of these main moon phases are taking place in fixed signs, which reinforce the overarching theme of Scorpio season being a time of epitome. And notice how we can tune into the elements and their alternating masculine and feminine affinities to be both exerting energy effectively and being open to receive the benefits of doing so. From there, we'll shift out of this chapter of fixed energy into a new pattern relating to the mutable or transitory signs of the zodiac in time for Sagittarius season in late November. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I really wasn't consistent with lunar astrology until fairly recently, because in our busy lives, this practice of paying attention to not just the moon phase, but also its sign, can seem really overwhelming or easy to lose track of unless you have an understanding of how it works, or unless you're putting a system in place to keep up with it in a relevant and sustainable practice. This idea of keeping up with both the moon's phases and signs used to really confuse and overwhelm me. I didn't understand why people on Instagram were making these memes that were pairing moon phases with signs of the zodiac, until I learned to look at it from this cyclical living perspective. After committing to practicing it for a while, I saw how magical, inspiring, and beneficial it could be in my cyclical living practice. And that's why I front-loaded the work of researching the dates of the phases and signs and creating prompts and notifications that not only remind us of when they are, but also provide a super simple template for learning the patterns and embodying the themes. I've designed journal prompt pages and pre-scheduled posts in the Writing Witch Coven to remind us of when the moon phases are, what sign they're in, and what questions to ask ourselves each week to naturally embrace their energies in practical, empowering ways. So now we don't just say it's the new moon, so I'm setting intentions. Now we can instead say it's the new moon in Leo, so I'm setting intentions related to my self-worth and confidence. And instead of saying it's the waxing moon, so I'm taking action, now we can say it's the waxing moon in Scorpio, so I'm taking action to embrace the taboo parts of myself instead of rejecting them. I've done all of this work for you and for myself so that we can embody the flow of it going forward. So if this aspect of cyclical living inspires you, but you don't want it to take up too much time and energy each week, then the Writing Witch Coven is where you want to be. It's also for you if you're feeling inspired by the mind-blowing information in this video and this series. This series is packed with powerful information that you're going to want to remember, and since I want you to be able to retain and implement it in empowering ways, you don't have to worry about writing it all down. Members of the Build Your Complete Grimoire tier in the Writing Witch Coven on Patreon are receiving a grimoire chapter for their binder this month that's essentially a written version of everything we went over in this video. But regardless of which tier you decide to join, all Coven members get support to stay consistent in our cyclical witchy lifestyles by tuning into a few journal prompts per week that keep us in tune with the Sabbath seasons, zodiac wheel, and moon signs, all of which work together to guide our well-balanced practice. Each member receives a beautifully designed grimoire prompt page, as well as notifications when it's an important astrological phase or seasonal checkpoint, so you never have to feel like you're falling out of tune with the cycles of nature, even if you're busy. Depending on which tier you decide to join, you'll get access to lunar astrology prompts only, or upgrade to join us for our yearly seasonal living challenge, where we journal and set intentions on the themes of the 8 Sabbats in the 6 weeks surrounding each checkpoint on the Wheel of the Year. Or upgrade to the top tier, which gets all of the above, plus a handmade Book of Shadows binder and a whole new set of themed information and prompt pages each month, which in 2024 include a beautiful transcript of each zodiac video. Okay, so now that we're done nerding out about the what and the why of Scorpio season and where it fits into the Wheel of the Year, let's shift into embodiment by delving into the how to embrace the season. Here are 4 powerful themes of Scorpio season, using the 4 elements as a guide. How you go about embodying these ideas will differ depending on what your goals and practice are like, but for real-world examples, I'll be sharing how I'm embracing these themes. You can plan to focus on one theme per week in alignment with the elements of the 4 main moon phases we discussed above, or you can simply go about them whenever you feel inspired to do so throughout the season. Fire. Have a candlelit or lantern-lit evening. Just like any of the other Sabbats on the Wheel of the Year, November's Eve is known to be celebrated by gathering around a bonfire. Only even more, since this one in particular is specially suited for it. Samhain is both one of the 4 Celtic fire festivals, and it also takes place at a time of year when it typically isn't too hot or too cold for us modern folk to have a campfire. For example, the summer solstice is also associated with bonfires, but in order to get that nighttime bonfire experience, you'd have to wait up until at least after 9 p.m. where I live. And even once it's dark, it might still be too hot to even want to be near a flame. But in October and November, the nights have begun to grow long and cool, and the weather is more mild, making it a perfect time to comfortably experience an outdoor fire in the dark without having to stay up too late. But whether or not having an actual bonfire is accessible for you this season, you can still enjoy the magic of gathering around a flame in the darkening evenings. While the sunset times will vary depending on where in the world you live, around these parts, the sun begins to set between about 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. in late fall. Instead of always flicking on the lights as soon as it begins getting dark, there's also something magical about enjoying some natural lighting. If you can safely do so, I recommend preparing and eating dinner by candlelight on some cozy fall evenings. I've even heard of an ancient Celtic-inspired tradition of turning off all the lights in your home on Samhain and ritualistically walking through your home with a single candle. This is said to stem from an ancient practice where the entire village would have attended a communal bonfire on Samhain, during which there would have been no fires or candles going in their vacant homes. After the celebration, they would each take an ember or light a lantern from the festival fire and use that to relight the fires and lamps in their own homes, symbolizing how the community depended on the elements as well as each other. If you decide you want to do this sort of thing more regularly, or if you have little ones or pets who shouldn't be around an open flame, it's best to use things like jar candles, candle lanterns, and oil lamps to more safely enclose the flame. And even if you can't or don't want to use real fire in your home at all, you could also try swapping out your fluorescent overhead lighting to yellow tinted LEDs or incandescent or halogen light bulbs, placed lower in the room or under lampshades. This creates a more soft, cozy golden glow that evokes a more classic and timeless feeling. You might even wish to purchase a flameless vintage-style lantern that gives the aesthetic of an oil lamp, but using electricity. There's something really enchanting and slightly spooky about having a single lantern or candle lit and being mindful of the enclosing darkness around you. If you move through the house with a small portable light like a lantern or candlestick, it's fascinating to see how isolated areas are illuminated and the shadows dance around as you go. It can take what would otherwise feel like mundane moments or tasks and makes them feel magical. And if you're using a real flame, there's also a deeper level of mindfulness, reverence, and care that comes along with this practice. You have to move about with a sense of awareness that you're working with a powerful and potentially dangerous natural element, which echoes the themes of Scorpio season. This practice is a simple yet enchanting way to acknowledge and romanticize the season, whether you're taking the time to do an official candlelit ritual or just bringing some magic and mindfulness into your regular evening routine. On a surface level, it creates a strong visual shift that helps us recognize and commemorate the changing of the seasons. But on a deeper level, I feel it also connects us to our ancestors in a simple way. After all, aside from the past couple of generations, all of our ancestors used either natural flame lighting or early electric lighting, which was designed in a way that was very reminiscent of flame lighting. Even once electricity was invented, most people would have had only a few small lamps that would have only dimly illuminated isolated areas of the home, and they would have lost power a lot more easily and more often than most of us are accustomed to now. This would have emphasized the fact that light was a commodity to be mindful of and grateful for. For us, this can serve as a simple reminder that light is actually not the norm in the universe, but the exception. Science tells us that the vast majority of the universe is total darkness, and it's only in these rare clusters of stars that light and life seem to exist. Again, reminding us of our place in the miraculous phenomenon of existence, and that there is so much mystery and curiosity yet to be discovered in the dark realm of the unknown. Earth, harvest and preserve your own food or herbs. Being the last of the harvest festivals, it's always a great idea to tap into the harvest theme in as literal a sense as possible this time of year. It helps us to connect with Mother Earth in one of the most simple and basic forms that most of our ancestors would have been much more familiar with. Knowing where our food comes from, what goes into producing it, and how best to preserve it really helps us to find our place in the circle of life and feel more grounded in our existence as earthlings. While it isn't always true in a literal sense, depending on where you live, Samhain season is essentially representative of our last big opportunity to harvest an abundance of seasonal food before the dead part of the agricultural year. What and how much we're able to harvest will also totally depend on where you live and what you have access to. But I believe that even if you live in a dense urban environment, there's always some way to experience the magic of harvesting. Whether you're bringing in the last of your own homegrown veggies, fruits, or herbs, taking a trip to a local nature area where you can find some good foraging, or venturing out to a local farm or seasonal market, there's always a way to connect with the local produce of the land or community you live on. When I lived in a more dense urban area, there was actually a farmer's market that would come right into that dense urban area because they knew people were desiring to connect with locally grown food. It's also fun to connect to nature and our ancestors by learning more about food preservation for fall. Our ancestors survived by learning various inventive ways to keep food abundant and edible through the winter and year ahead. In previous seasons, we talked about water-based techniques, such as pickling, fermenting, and canning. But another way to work with the elements to alchemize our harvest into long-lasting pantry staples is to dehydrate it. In its most basic form, dehydrating is the simple art of drying a once moist food or herb to prevent mold and rot and make it shelf-stable. It's easy and quite a traditional cottage witchy thing to do to simply string herbs up and let them dry naturally in the air. This past summer, I learned a fun new technique of stringing sprigs of herbs together on a needle and thread by simply piercing them through the stem. This kind of doubles as both a meditative ritual and some real-life witchy home decor. Nothing looks authentically witchier than harvested herbs hanging from places around your home. And this practice can be a little bit time-consuming, so it's a great opportunity to switch off from your usual activities and thought patterns, to chant your incantations for your intentions for the season ahead while you work. You could even turn it into a more intentional spell by weaving specific intentions into the herbal garland and hanging it up as an actual talisman in your home. But even in a more mundane sense, dehydrating is also just a great way to invite the energy of abundance into your home and kitchen. This time of year, when a lot of produce is still in season for the last time until next year, it's wise and economical to get them while they're on sale or pick them from nature and squirrel them away for the winter. If you don't have a ton of freezer space like I don't, learning to dehydrate various foodstuffs is a great option. I used to think you could only dehydrate certain herbs and produce, but I've been learning a lot about dehydrating and have discovered that with the right technique, you can dehydrate almost anything using an electric dehydrator or a low setting on your oven. I lucked out because right around the time I first started getting into these homesteading type practices, I was gifted a hand-me-down air fryer that actually happened to have a dehydrate setting on it, and it works great. And going back to that concept of merging the magical with the mundane, this practice of dehydrating food can double as an abundance spell for the year ahead, and it transforms your pantry into a literal altar to the spirit of abundance. Some people use store-bought Halloween decor or DIY fake witches bottles to decorate for the season, but as a hearth and home witch, nothing feels cozier than being surrounded just by jars and bottles of actual food and herbs that I've harvested and or preserved myself and will use in my real life. Water. Try your hand at brewing wine or hard cider, or just conjure up your own witch's brew. In some of the previous sections, we've discussed the alchemy of home brewing, mead or honey wine for spring and summer, and grain ale for the early harvest season. But now that autumn is well and truly underway, now is the time to try a brew made from those classic fall fruits like grapes and apples. This activity pairs really well with the above section on harvesting seasonal crops. Of course, you can always use ingredients from the grocery store if that's all that's available to you. But if you can forage, harvest from a garden or farm, or purchase directly from a farmer's market, all the better. There are lots of expert tips and tools out there for rendering wine and cider from fruit, but at its most basic level, all you really need are the juice of your fruit of choice, yeast, and a container with a suitable lid for fermenting. You can render the juice yourself from fresh fruit, or you can simply purchase it ready-made from the store or farmer's market. In fact, the first time I ever had homemade hard cider, it was a happy accident. I had been to our local apple orchard where I always like to buy a jug of regular cider along with picking my own apples. But one year it was unseasonably warm in late October, and we made the mistake of buying the cider first and then leaving it in the car for hours while we explored the farm. I noticed a few days later that even having been stored in the fridge, the cider was beginning to transform into something different. At first, I assumed it was turning into apple cider vinegar, something I had experienced with store-bought cider that I had left in the fridge for far too long. But this time, the fermentation process was happening much more quickly, and it wasn't giving vinegar vibes. It was fizzing up and becoming a slightly carbonated and delightfully flavored hard cider. Knowing what I now know about the various forms of fermentation, my guess is that the reason for this reaction was due to something called wild yeast. The term wild yeast refers to any of various yeasts occurring naturally in the environment, in the air, or on surfaces, especially of fruit. My theory is that fruits, and especially pasteurized fruit juices from the grocery store, are a lot less likely to contain wild yeast because they go through so many cleaning and preparation processes, whereas this locally made cider was clearly a lot more natural and wild in origin, and since we didn't keep it consistently refrigerated to prevent that bacterial process from starting, it started to carbonate itself. I would love to try this again in a more controlled experiment to see if I could replicate the results. But in any case, I've also made hard cider simply by using juice or cider from the grocery store and a pinch of regular bread yeast. As with all the home brews we discussed in previous videos, you just need to choose a large container with a lid that can allow gases to escape without letting air and bugs in. You can easily purchase a simple airlock or use my favorite DIY method, a very well-washed candle jar with one of those rubber ringed glass lids. Combine the juice with a pinch of yeast and optional addition of sugar. The difference between a lightly alcoholic cider and a stronger wine is that additional sugar is added to wine for the yeast to convert into more alcohol. Close the lid and leave it in a dark place for anywhere from a few days to a few months. These things are supposed to get better with age, but to be honest, mine never make it that long on the shelf. When it stops actively bubbling and the spent yeast has collected at the bottom of the jar, you can carefully pour off the wine from the debris, optionally back sweeten if it's too sour for you, and enjoy. Early Scorpio season is a great time to start a batch of cider or wine to be enjoyed around Samhain, or any time during the Samhain season is a great time to start a longer brew that can be later enjoyed as wassail, mulled wine, or glug during the upcoming Yuletide season. And to make this practice even extra witchy, you can brew your intentions and relevant spices into it to make a drinkable potion for the fall and or winter seasons ahead. I found it really fun to learn about the tradition of wassailing, a historic European tradition of making offerings of cider to the apple orchards and singing to them in the hopes of having an abundant harvest in the year to come. Depending on the time period and culture, this can take place anywhere between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. It also bleeds over into the Yule tradition of the wassail bowl, where a community would make a brew of cider, wine, and spices to be carried to each household, where songs would be sung and people would add more to the bowl as it was continually passed around. If this concept excites you, I highly recommend you do a YouTube or Google search for wassailing to learn more about this enchanting custom. And of course, if you don't want to wait for something to brew, you can easily take the same concept of mixing ingredients with intention, and you can always just pop a cauldron on the stove with store-bought juice, cider, wine, spices, or whatever. It reminds me of a time, even before I identified as a witch, when my college house and I had a Halloween party, and my roommate found a recipe for spiked apple cider. She reminded me of a cute little witch, stirring this massive cauldron of witch's brew for hours before the party. Both our apartment and our friends upstairs filling with the festive smell of apples and spices. By the time the guests arrived, this brew was the most delicious fall drink you had ever tasted, and you'd never know it was chock full of high-proof vodka. So this was rather deadly, and everyone had a great time. Ever since then, I always loved the idea of each of us coming up with our own witch's brew to make each year. But of course, if you don't do alcohol, your witch's brew can be totally non-alcoholic. The possibilities are endless. Air. Learn about the history and traditions of fall, Halloween, and the harvest. Raise your hand if one of your gateways into the world of witchery came from an interest in the magic of the harvest season or spooky season. For me, it actually started with the autumn equinox and seamlessly segued into Halloween time. I had been on my spiritual journey for a few years and had crossed paths with the concept of things like solstices and equinoxes being sacred, which seemed in line with my lifelong veneration for the changing of seasons. But I had yet to really dig into it as far as research was concerned. But one late summer day, I was looking for a sense of direction in my creative and spiritual life, and I happened to look outside my office window to notice a single orange leaf that had popped up seemingly all of a sudden. I glanced at the calendar to see the term autumn equinox in small print on that day's date. I finally decided to do a quick search engine inquiry on the spiritual significance of the autumn equinox, and that was the first day of the rest of my life as a seasonal witch. I learned that the harvest time was considered sacred to every ancient culture, and that quickly led to diving down the rabbit hole of the history and magical traditions of the harvest season as a whole, not least of all is to do with the origins of Halloween itself. If you've never gone down a research rabbit hole on the history and traditions of the seasons, this is the absolute perfect time to read, watch, or listen to some educational content on it. Not only does this late fall season lend itself really well to cozying up with your favorite fall drinks and snacks, reading or watching documentaries, or listening to podcasts or audiobooks while harvesting, cooking, decorating, preserving, or taking nature walks. But the late fall into early winter phase is also the most abundant time for consuming educational content because the most research and content has been done on it. Obviously, Halloween through Christmas encompasses the holiday season that's commonly celebrated even through to today. So pagans and non-pagans alike have been interested to learn and teach on this quarter of the year most. But what was so mind-blowing for me when I was first getting started was getting to see how this quote-unquote holiday season really is just that, 1/4 of a full cycle of seasonal checkpoints that would have all been sacred and important to our ancestors. It's interesting to see how this particular phase of the plant, tend, harvest, compost cycle accumulated so much meaning and so many traditions over time, even to the point that parts of it remained relevant into the modern day when most of us are a lot less aware of the other parts of the agricultural cycle. While we're running short on time with this video, if this is a subject that you're curious about, then I would love to invite you to grab your copy of the Fall 2024 edition of Starlight Magazine, where I wrote a whole article specifically on the spooky season and why we think of the fall as the season of the witch. If you're new around here, Starlight Magazine is a seasonal publication that comes out 4 times a year. It's published by the Witch of Lupin Hollow, aka my friend and colleague Tanae Stewart. I've been honored to be able to include an article in every magazine that's come out since winter 2021, and now I'm also the editor, and I always get super excited when a new one is coming out, and I like to let you guys know about it. Life has been super busy this year with gardening and so many different projects, so I didn't get to include a flip-through video of the summer edition. That one was really good too though, and like all of the magazines that have come out in the last few years, you can purchase back issues in digital form. But if you're like me and you love to have a physical magazine in your hands, then I would love to invite you to sign up for a subscription. The print editions tend to sell out super quickly, and the fall one has already sold out as well. But if you want to have the physical copies in your hands going forward, then the link to sign up will be below. If you love the concepts that we talk about on this channel, where we're combining astrology with the Wheel of the Year, with slow living and mental health and self-care and all of those good things, then you are going to love Starlight Magazine, where myself, the other staff writers, and guest writers for each issue will be sharing our diverse perspectives on how to live a magical life. And if you appreciate my work and want to support me to continue making this magical content, then signing up for a subscription or purchasing any physical or digital copy of any of the magazines from my affiliate link will ensure that a percentage of your purchase goes to me so that I can continue these magical adventures. So if you're purchasing one now, or if you have ever purchased a magazine in the past, I just want to say thank you so much. So as you can see, I could go on and on about the magic of the fall season. But duh, that's why I started my YouTube channel, as I was going through my first year in a day adventure into seasonal witchery, and have continued learning and sharing about it here ever since. If you happen to be curious about where this YouTube channel started, I've actually resisted the urge to delete that early, slightly cringeworthy video series from 8 years ago, because it's important to remember the value of our roots and to let viewers see our realistic journey of growth as content creators. So feel free to have a look if you want to have a little bit of a laugh. There's still valuable content in there. It's just very 101, and I wasn't quite as good at delivering content as I am now, but it's interesting because you can see me get much better at it from the first video in that series to the last one about a year later. In any case, how are you feeling inspired to dig deeper into the magic and mystery of life this Samhain and Scorpio season? I would love to hear your ideas in the comments. And be sure to join us in the Writing Witch Coven to get a beautiful written transcript of this episode for your grimoire and to easily stay in tune with cyclical living. Memberships start as low as $11 a month, and we would love to have you. And for more ideas on how to embrace the November's Eve themes, I invite you to check out this video right here. Or if you've already seen that one, come and join me on my Green Witchy / Cottage Witchery vlog channel to see what kind of magical mischief I'm getting up to this season. See you there!